Welcome to the session, Dual Language Learners, Development, Assessment, and Policy. My name is Young-Soo Kim, and I am the session organizer. The session has 4 papers. The first paper is on English-Spanish cognates by Maria Carlo and colleagues. Then, Doris Baker will discuss development of a formative vocabulary measure in the science area. The third paper is on higher order cognitive skills and writing in English and Spanish by Young-Soo Kim and colleagues. Lastly, Kristen Black and colleagues will present their study on heterogeneity in math course taking for English learners.
Hi, my name is Maria Carlo, and I'll be presenting on linguistic moderators of cognate effects on academic vocabulary of 4th grade dual language learners. I'd like to acknowledge the contributions of the rest of the team, which includes Dr. Mary Avalos from the University of Miami, Dr. Jeffrey Williams from the University of South Florida, and Dr. Jason Anthony, also from the University of South Florida. This work I'll be reporting on is based on analyses of data that come from a measurement pilot that is part of our larger grant entitled The Effect of Definitions, Contextual Support, and Cognate Status on 4th grade speaking English learners' understanding of unfamiliar words in text. Mary Avalos of the University of Miami and I are co-PIs on this grant. So there is reason to believe that cognates and non-cognates differ in the ease with which they are learned, since cognates are etymologically related words with similar spelling and meaning in 2 languages. Research on the cross-language transfer of vocabulary knowledge via cognates has consistently shown positive effects on vocabulary acquisition. And you could see the review by Dressler and Camille that covers the English language set of research on this topic, and with a concentration on school children. However, the effects of cognates appear to be influenced by the orthographical and phonological similarity of the words in 2 languages, students' perceptions of this similarity, and student levels of metalinguistic awareness and language proficiency. Thus, the current work set out to investigate which factors contribute to the production of a cognate facilitation effect. We asked, does cognate status predict performance on a measure of definition knowledge of academically challenging English words? Does performance vary in relation to orthographic similarity across English and Spanish? Does performance on cognates and non-cognates vary by part of speech and English word frequency and dispersion? And finally, is the effect of cognate status moderated by English and/or Spanish proficiency? Our sample consisted of 4th grade participants, 207 Spanish-speaking students with English learner designation. The average age was 10 years. There were 111 girls, and they came from 15 schools in a large district in the southeast of the United States. Income information was collected across 9 categories in $10,000 increments, ranging from under $10,000 to over $80,000. This question was answered by 174 of the parents in the sample. For ease of presentation, I've collapsed the information into the 3 categories that you see here. We also collected parent education information, and 182 parents contributed responses to this question. And you could see the distribution across the levels of education in this table. Our measures included predictors and outcomes, of course. English and Spanish subtests of the Woodcock-Munoz language survey served as our predictors. These had the picture vocabulary subtest and the passage comprehension subtest, each in Spanish and English. The outcome variable was an experimenter-developed multiple choice test of knowledge of word definitions. There was a pool of 141 items that varied by part of speech, frequency, and word dispersion. Each of the children completed 36 randomly selected items from this pool of 141 items. In terms of our word pool, Prior to selecting the words for our outcome measure, we conducted an analysis of the language arts reading series used by the district. We obtained frequency, dispersion, and familiarity indices for all words that were explicitly targeted for instruction in the reading series. Then we selected a pool of new words using the word level parameters we had obtained for the words in the reading series. We also took into consideration Beck and colleagues' criteria for tier 2 words. These are the characteristics of the words. Let me note that word dispersion refers to how widely used a word is across different content areas. So if a score of 0 indicates the lowest amount of dispersion and 1 indicates the highest amount of dispersion. So as you can see, we selected words for inclusion in our measure that we believe to be comparable to words deemed worthy of instruction in the curriculum the students were receiving. And we consider these words to be academically challenging words. In the outcome measure, we use definitions of the English test words as provided in the Collins Birmingham University International Language Database, or COBILD. COBILD is based on empirical data of English word usage rather than the judgment of lexicographers. It also breaks with the definition conventions followed by most dictionaries by using full sentence definitions with the goal of increasing comprehensibility. In this example, you can appreciate the characteristics of COBILD definitions relative to Merriam-Webster's, for instance. The measurement procedure involved an individually administered computer-presented task that provided auditory support for all items. The items appeared in a multiple choice format. Examinees were presented with a definition and asked to select the word that best matches that definition, as seen in this slide. The analytic strategy used a generalized linear model to analyze the data. To account for nesting, a random intercept was modeled for both child and school. Before examining the primary research question, the relation between cognate status and percentage correct, we first evaluated the relations to other word level covariates. And finally, we explored moderator relationships of cognate status, beginning with the word level covariates and then examining the role of English and Spanish language. And so to elaborate on the third bullet, the 3 word level characteristics we examined as potential covariates were part of speech, the Zeno standardized frequency index, and the Zeno dispersion index, as mentioned previously. All 3 variables were significant predictors of percentage correct. Nouns were slightly easier than verbs and modifiers. As expected, higher frequency words were slightly easier. And oddly, higher dispersion words were associated with decreased probability of being correct. Therefore, all 3 word level variables were retained in the model. We then entered cognate status into the model to examine its relation over and above the covariates I just mentioned. But contrary to expectation, there was not a statistically significant difference between cognates and non-cognates. Therefore, our primary hypothesis was not supported. However, given the differences we observed in the covariates, we conducted some post hoc analyses to examine whether cognate status would demonstrate differences for certain types or properties of words. So to this end, we entered 2-way interactions between cognate status and the 3 covariates into the model. The interaction of dispersion with cognate status was not significant, but those with frequency and part of speech were reliable. And so let's look at these in a little bit more detail. So here we see the results of the post hoc analysis of cognate status as a function of word frequency as indexed by Zeno. Non-cognates are plotted in blue, cognates are plotted in orange. And so whereas the relation between percentage correct and frequency was positive for non-cognates, that for cognates was slightly negative or not significantly different from 0. So it appears that English word frequency is impacting cognates and non-cognates differently, in that cognates do not seem to vary in relation to English word frequency. In this figure, we see the results of post hoc analyses of cognate status as a function of part of speech. This time, cognates are plotted in blue and non-cognates in orange, and my apologies for this switch. With respect to part of speech, cognate status did demonstrate a difference in percentage correct for nouns and verbs, though in the opposite direction for verbs, but not for modifiers. So given this result, we decided to analyze the effect of orthographic similarity to see if it could shed some light on the effects due to part of speech. And basically, we reasoned that nouns may have higher orthographic similarity for cognates than verbs or modifiers, given the presence of affixes in the latter two. We calculated orthographic similarity for cognates and non-cognates against their closest translation in Spanish equivalent and used a Levenstein distance score as the measure. When we entered this score into the model, neither cognate status nor orthographic similarity were significant. And so in future analyses, we'll be looking at those separately. And for now, we're going to continue with the cognate and non-cognate categorical distinction. So although the main effect of cognate status was not supported, we still wanted to pursue the research question regarding moderation of any cognate effects by language status, as mentioned previously. Language status was indexed using the vocabulary and passage comprehension scores from the Woodcock Language Survey in both English and Spanish, and all analyses were conducted separately for these two language measures and separately by the subtests. Our analysis of the moderation by language status included the three-way interactions between cognate status, the covariates, and the two language measures, yielding 4 tests of moderation. So cognate status by part of speech by English vocabulary, cognate status by xenofrequency by English vocabulary, and so on for passage comprehension. So before I talk about this graph, let me tell you a little bit about the null effects we obtained. There were many. For vocabulary, neither of the cognate effects was moderated by English vocabulary. Neither of the cognate effects was reliably moderated by Spanish vocabulary, although the moderation of part of speech approached significance. For passage comprehension, neither of the cognate effects was moderated by English passage performance. Spanish passage comprehension did not moderate the interaction, including xenofrequency, but it did moderate that of cognate status and part of speech. And so that's what we'll talk a little bit about now. So figure 3 presents the interactions of Spanish passage comprehension and the interaction between cognate status and part of speech. Now, this is not an easy figure to read, so I'll summarize it by saying that essentially non-cognate nouns and modifiers were no different from 0. Oddly, non-cognate verbs were significantly different from 0. But as expected, all other cognate effects were small and positive and significantly different from 0, suggesting better cognate performance across all parts of speech as a function of Spanish passage comprehension. So to summarize, neither of the cognate effects was moderated by English vocabulary. So English vocabulary is not producing the cognate advantage, differences in English vocabulary in subjects. Neither of the cognate effects was reliably moderated by Spanish vocabulary, although the moderation of part of speech approached significance. Neither of the cognate effects was moderated by English passage comprehension. However, Spanish passage comprehension moderated the effect of cognate status and part of speech, such that with better passage comprehension performance, a stronger cognate effect was observed. We're not at a point in this work to be extracting grand conclusions about these data, so I'll pose some further questions for investigation. So the effect due to part of speech requires further investigation. So if we're going to improve the efficiency of vocabulary instruction for Spanish-speaking EL, should we be paying more attention to the development of morphological analysis skills so that they can become more adept at exploiting their Spanish word knowledge across all parts of speech? And so the question really is, would our results have been clearer had we included a measure of morphological awareness? Also, to improve our estimates of vocabulary difficulty for Spanish-speaking English learners, should we be incorporating Spanish proficiency information in the calculation of those difficulty indices, since it seems to contribute to the prediction of word difficulty for this population of English learners? Thank you, and you can reach me at my email listed here.
Hello, my name is Doris Baker, and I'm an associate professor at the University of Texas at Austin. The grant I will be talking about is titled Measuring the Language and Vocabulary Acquisition in Science of Latinx Students, or MELVA-S for short. The purpose of my presentation is to report on the initial development of an online science vocabulary formative assessment for second and third grade Latinx bilingual students using a speech recognition system and automated scoring. The team will produce 24 equivalent alternate forms of MELVA that can be used for teachers to assess their student initial status and growth of vocabulary knowledge. This project addresses inequities in education by first including Latinx students from the start instead of developing a measure with English-only students first. Second, it uses state-of-the-art technology to identify the vocabulary strengths and needs of Latinx bilingual students. And third, it is intended to enhance instruction by providing teachers with information about their student level of vocabulary knowledge. MELVA-S is a collaborative project that includes the University of Texas at Austin, the Meadows Center for Preventing Educational Risk, Southern Methodist University, and California State University, Long Beach. The project cannot be completed without the support of graduate students and undergraduate students, our consultants, and of course, our research team. So why is vocabulary important in science? Perhaps the quote that Speicher provided in 2008 is indicative of the need to teach vocabulary in science. What he says is that learning language is a major part of science education and a major barrier for most students, yet a focus on learning language is not always a priority in elementary science classrooms. Michaels et al. Also says that there are no native speakers of science, suggesting that teaching the language of science is necessary to understand it. In addition, the next generation science standards require students to use precise language to acquire deeper comprehension of the topic they are studying, and the National Research Council states that scientific proficiency depends on using and interpreting scientific explanations of the natural world and participating productively in scientific practices and discourse. So how did we go about developing this measure? First, we selected the words and we consider the science domains that need to be taught in second and third grade. So we were particularly interested in words that students need to describe, explain, analyze, and discuss science phenomena. As you can see on the table, there are 4 topics included in the NGSS and the Texas standards for second and third grade. And it is earth science, life science, physical science, and scientific processes, which refers to all the words that are needed to understand science practices such as analyze, describe, explain, interpret. We tried to balance the words across these 4 domains. Then we also looked at the words from 4 different sources. One was from a former intervention we developed prior to MELVA, focused on teaching science and social studies to second grade bilingual students. We examined the NGSS, the Texas standards, and also science programs to determine what words to select. We coded the words based on the domain where we found them, and as you can see, some words fit really in all 4 domains, such as the verb identify, which indicates to us that the word will be used and is actually needed to explain any phenomena in these 4 domains. We also consulted with teachers. We recruited 11 teachers across grades 2 and 3 who had at least 5 years of experience teaching science to Latinx students. Here you can see that we had 8 teachers who were ESL certified, 5 were bilingual certified, and 7 had a science background, which could include also a master's in science or expertise in developing science programs. In addition, we also asked experts, consultants, their thoughts about the words we selected. For example, Dr. Margaret McCowan, a vocabulary expert, encouraged us to consider how words could be taught to students. And Dr. Anthony Petrosino, a science expert, discussed how these words would fit in building a deeper understanding of science concepts across grades. We developed a Qualtrics survey to obtain input from 3 different groups. So we had the teachers, the expert team, and the research team. And then we coded the words based on 5 categories. And the one we were particularly interested in was category 4, where students should be able to understand and be able to use this word, the word provided. And then you can see that we also, of course, wanted to know which words were too easy, potentially for students in 2nd and 3rd grade, as well as too hard. The results from the survey suggested at least 2 of the 3 groups coded the words as a 3 or a 4, at least 96% of the time. And then approximately 236 words were coded with a 4 by 2 of the 3 groups. Dr. Josh Lawrence, also one of our consultants, did an analysis of the words we had selected by comparing the characteristics of our words based on several corpora of words, such as the academic word list and the corpus of American English. And based on the words we had selected, he created different scatter plots that show relations between word characteristics. For example, in this scatter plot, you can see that there is a significant relation between the different meanings of words and where they appear based on the academic word list. This type of analysis is interesting to us, of course, for the project, because it will help us examine the student level of science vocabulary when they are completing the measure. For example, based on how students define and use the word table will tell us their level of understanding of the scientific meaning of table. In other words, they only know the meaning of table as a piece of furniture or also as a way to display data. So in addition to selecting the words and deciding which ones to add into the measure, we are also building the speech recognition system and the automated scoring. And the way we are approaching this, this task is by first using, for the speech recognition system, we're using a commercial cloud transcription service with custom science vocabularies. And for the automated scoring system, we are using pre-trained natural language models to automatically score the appropriateness of context and word selection. And here you can see how a student could be taking the measure. So they wear heads and a microphone, and then a question is presented to them about the word. And the student presses the space bar to talk. And this response gets recorded and then analyzed, transcribed and then analyzed. So here's an example of human scoring from a previous project, but this is what inspired us to develop this proposal. And so, for example, for the word erupt, you can see that student A defined it as to explode with force. He would score a 2, which is the highest score for definitions. And then he used the word erupt in a sentence by saying volcanoes erupt because the lava inside is getting too hot. And then he got also a 2 for that sentence. On the other hand, for example, student C defined the word as like you drink. And so we would have scored that, we would score that as a 0. And then for the sentence, I have erupt, we also scored this as a 0. So what we want to do now with the automated scoring system is try to replicate these human scores by using different language models. And we have already done a little bit of research on that with the previous project that we had, ELVA, English Language Vocabulary Acquisition, also funded by IES. And you can see that for the first 4 models, the reliability was relatively low. So now we are exploring a different model, language model, which is called BERT. And for this model, you'll see that the reliability increased significantly to 2.83. So we hope to explore this language model more closely to see if it gives us a higher reliability and comparable, hopefully, to human scoring or as close as possible to that. BIRD stands for bidirectional encoder representations from transformers. So then as next steps, we will be collecting student data in early spring, and all our Latinx students in second and third grade in the districts that are agreed to collaborate with us will be invited to participate. And this data will help us refine the speech recognition system, as well as the automated scoring system, and as well as also the determining the item difficulty, so how difficult are those words for students in those grades. And then students will be allowed to respond in Spanish if they prefer. And at this point, right now, we are going to translate what they say and then transcribe it and analyze it, just because of the system is not quite ready yet to receive and immediately score Spanish responses. But at least we know we'll have them, and we'll be scoring them by data collectors as well as by the system. Thank you very much. And if you have any questions, please don't hesitate to email me.
Hi, my name is Youngsu Grace Kim at the University of California, Irvine. And I'm going to share our study on cross-linguistic associations of higher order cognitive skills and their relations to writing for dual language learners. And I would like to recognize our co-authors here. This study was guided by the following two research questions. The first one is, how are writing skills in narrative and opinion genres and higher order cognitive skills, such as inference, perspective taking, and comprehension monitoring in English and Spanish, best described in terms of dimensionality for Spanish-English dual language learners in primary grades? The second question is, how do the identified dimensions of higher order cognitive skills relate to the identified dimensions of written composition, controlling for sex, poverty status, grade levels, schools, English learner status, and biliterate status? Do the relations differ by instructional programs, such as structured English immersion program versus Spanish-English dual immersion program? Writing involves recursive processes of generating, translating, organizing, revising, and transcribing ideas. According to the direct and indirect effects model of writing, these writing processes draw on a number of knowledge, language, and cognitive skills, including higher order cognitive skills and regulation, such as reasoning, inferencing, perspective taking, and monitoring, as they support establishing coherence. A small but growing number of studies supports the relations of higher order cognitive skills to writing quality for students in elementary grades, as well as those in secondary schools. Research also has examined writing for dual language learners. However, majority of studies tend to focus on adult learners and language features in second language. One prominent idea in second language and literacy acquisition is the cross-linguistic interdependence hypothesis. According to this hypothesis, L2 competence is partially a function of the type of competence already developed in L1. In other words, one can benefit from and utilize resources or skills developed in L1 for their L2 acquisition, or vice versa. Extant studies with adults who learn English as a foreign language show that writing skills in L1 and L2 are related. In the present study, we expand prior work in several ways. First, we examined writing in L1 and L2 by dual language learners in primary grades. We also examined higher order cognitions in both L1 and L2 and explored the dimensionality of higher order cognitions and writing in L1 and L2. A total of 317 Spanish-English dual language learners in grades 1 and 2 from 23 classrooms in the Southwest region of the US participated in the study. Approximately 53% were girls, 89% were Hispanic children, and 8% were white children. About 84% were eligible for the free and reduced lunch program. Approximately 84% were English learners, and 69% were in the English-Spanish dual language program, whereas 31% were in structured English immersion program. About half of the sample were considered biliterate, such that they provided writing samples in each of the two languages when prompted to. Some children wrote only in one language, regardless of target languages in the writing tasks. Regardless of whether children wrote in target language or not, their compositions were scored following the rubric, and all children were included in the data analysis, and biliterate status was included as a control variable. Children's written composition was measured in narrative and opinion genres. In the narrative genre, tool 3 was used, using the skateboard prompt in English and soccer prompt in Spanish. In these prompts, children were shown a series of 3 illustrations and were asked to write a story that goes with the illustrations. In the opinion genre, YA3 was used in English, an adapted version of a previously used experimental prompt called favorite animal was used in Spanish. In the YA task, the child was asked to write about her favorite game and 3 reasons. In the favorite animal task, the child was asked to write about their favorite animal and provide 3 reasons. For each writing prompt, children were given 15 minutes. Children's written compositions in both languages were typed up verbatim, and the typed up versions were used for evaluation. Their writing quality was evaluated as a quality and organization of ideas on a scale of 0 to 7. 2 English-Spanish bilingual research assistants were rigorously trained. Using 200 written compositions per prompt in each language, exact agreement was 0.95 in narrative tasks and 0.95 in opinion tasks in both languages. Higher order cognitive skills were measured in both languages. In English, children's inference skill was measured by the inference task of Castle. Students' perspective taking was measured by a theory of mind task. Theory of mind is one's ability to understand others' mental states and perspectives, such as thoughts, emotions, desires, and beliefs, and was used as a measure of perspective taking skill. A normed theory of mind measure called Theory of Mind Inventory 2, TOMI 2, was used. Comprehension monitoring was measured by an inconsistency detection task. In this task, the child heard a short scenario and was asked to identify whether the story made sense or not. And if the child said that the story did not make sense, they were asked to explain why. Higher order cognitive skills in Spanish were also measured. For theory of mind, the Spanish version of TOMI 2 was used. For inference and comprehension monitoring, we developed items to an iterative process modeling after English versions because of absence of inference and comprehension monitoring tasks in Spanish. English-Spanish bilingual research assistants worked with children in a quiet space in the school. Higher order cognitive tasks were individually administered in 2 sessions. One session with English tasks and the other with Spanish tasks. The order of English and Spanish tasks within each session was mixed across children. To address the question of dimensionality of higher order cognitive skills in writing in English and Spanish, 3 alternative structures were tested for higher order cognitive skills and written composition, respectively. For higher order cognitive skills, the first model tested a bi-factor structure with a general factor for cognitive skills for the general factor of higher order cognitive skills with a specific factor for English skills and a specific factor for Spanish skills. And you can see here on the left side of the figure. The second model tested a bi-factor structure with a specific factor for theory of mind, a specific factor for comprehension monitoring, and specific factor for inference. And of course, with the general factor for higher order cognition. And again, look at the left side of the figure. The third model tested a unidimensional structure with all the measures in English and Spanish loading onto a single cognitive factor. Now, turning to the dimensionality of written composition, look at the right side of the figure. First, we tested a bi-factor model with the specific factors by language. You can see, so there's a general factor of writing, but then there's also specific factor by Spanish and English. The second bi-factor model has a general factor of writing and also specific factors by genre. So you can see narrative and opinion. And the third model, see on the bottom right, it was a unidimensional model with all the writing measures loading onto a single writing factor. So the combination of the 3 models for higher order cognitive skills and written composition resulted in a total of 9 alternative models. The model fit of the 9 confirmatory factor analysis models is presented in the table, and the best fitting model was model 3, which is shown here. Coefficient mega, which is a measure of reliability. So coefficient mega for the general factor of higher order cognition was 0.85, which indicates that it was a reliable factor. The specific English factor and specific Spanish factor were not reliable. The writing factor was reliable as well. To examine the relations of higher order cognitions to writing, a multi-group analysis, a multi-group model was fit to the data. The groups included students in the structured English immersion program and students in the English-Spanish dual immersion program. Students' demographics, grade levels, and schools were included as control variables. When we conducted invariance testing, it showed that the configural model fit the data best. For students in the structured English immersion program, the higher order cognition general factor was moderately related to writing quality. The covariates in higher order cognition general factor accounted for 39% of the variance in writing quality. And we're showing here only the statistically significant control variables. For students in the Spanish-English dual language program, the relation was very similar. The combination of cognate covariates in the higher order cognition general factor accounted for 40% of the variance in writing quality. Overall, we found that higher order cognitions, for higher order cognitions, bi-factor model fit the data best, where students' performance on the English and Spanish higher order cognitive tasks reflected a general factor across languages with language-specific factors. For writing quality, we found that English and Spanish writing and narrative and opinion genres tasks best reflected a single underlying skill, at least for English-Spanish dual language learners in primary grades. Higher order cognition was moderately related to writing quality after accounting for demographic backgrounds, and the relation was similar for students in structured English immersion program and English-Spanish dual language program. These results overall suggest a potential transfer of higher order cognitions and writing skills between English and Spanish. The results also suggest a positive and moderate relation of higher order cognitions to writing, which is in line with due. Some limitations include in terms of generalizability. As usual in any studies, the generalizability of the findings is limited to the populations that are similar to the sample included in the study. In this case, Spanish-English dual language learners in primary grades in the US. Future efforts are warranted to replicate the study with different populations of dual language learners. In addition, future studies can examine independent roles of higher order cognitive skills to writing over and above the skills not included in the study, such as oral language skills. Lastly, regarding the transfer of higher order cognitions and writing skills between languages, experimental work is necessary to consider or examine causality. Thank you so much.
Good morning. My name is Kristen Black, and I have the honor of presenting this preliminary work on heterogeneity in math course taking among English learners as part of a newly funded multi-site Center for the Success of English Learners. The purpose of the center is to improve educational outcomes for English learners in middle and high school through a focused program of research on policies and practices. This particular presentation comes out of the policy strand of the project, which is headed up by David Francis at the Texas Institute for Measurement, Evaluation, and Statistics at the University of Houston, and Michael Kiefer at New York University, and all of the other talented folks listed here. But this is really just one part of the work that CSEL will be undertaking. And although I'm not discussing it today, our colleagues at UT Austin, at the Center for Applied Linguistics, and at SERP are instrumental in developing and launching the intervention work that will take place in the center over the next 4 years. The policy strand is really focused on the question of how English learners access or do not access important content in the general curriculum, and the extent to which district and state policies, school level practices, and educator attitudes lead to ELs being tracked away from important content and into classes where they have relatively little contact with native speakers. We're looking at the extent to which those two phenomena have detrimental effects on 4 critical outcomes: content learning, English proficiency, high school graduation, and post-secondary access. And today I'm going to be focusing on some initial work on ELs access to math. We're starting with math in part because the linearity of the curriculum makes it somewhat easier to infer how students' earlier course taking might be supporting or constraining their later course taking. And really, there's been quite a lot of work at this stage from various perspectives about the role of Algebra 1 as the gatekeeper for the rest of the math sequence, and about the role of Algebra 2 and trigonometry as an important precursor to success in college mathematics. We're also starting with math because it is presumably one subject area where you would expect there to be less tracking, where differences in language background would be less problematic. And yet what we see in studies from Oregon and other states is that ELs seem to have less access to general math classes, and particularly to advanced math classes, than their non-EL peers. And of course, we know from lots of work that ELs are a tremendously diverse group in terms of their English proficiency, their prior academic preparation, and their access to the general curriculum, depending on their particular context. And we're examining that heterogeneity in New York City and Houston as a way of examining how these two different policy contexts might be shaping ELs' progression through the math sequence. Our research questions focus on how ELs' patterns of math course taking across high school differ from those of non-ELs, whether student characteristics and prior academic achievement explain those patterns, and whether there are differences between New York City and Houston, the greater Houston metropolitan area, which are two cities with important but very different EL populations. We're working with 3 cohorts of 9th graders from 2014 to 2016, and the Houston sample is solely from this last academic year. Our main analysis is restricted to students with enrollment records from 7th or 8th grade so that we can control for prior academic achievement. And then we conduct a separate robustness check for newcomer Ls who are brand new to the district in grade 9. Our subgroups follow other work that disaggregates by language background and number of years as an L. Our non-Ls include those who were never Ls because they speak English only, those who speak another language at home but who were initially classified as proficient in English when they entered the system, and former Ls who were reclassified prior to 9th grade. And among those who were classified as Ls during grade 9, we make the following distinctions between newcomers, those students with fewer than 3 years of documented language service, developing Ls with 4 to 6 years, and long-term Ls. I won't linger here on the sample sizes, except to point out that the New York sample is quite a bit larger since it contains 3 cohorts rather than 1. There are also some notable differences in the size of the subgroups here. So both newcomer Ls and initially fluent students constitute much larger proportions of the sample in New York than in Houston. And long-term Ls and those who were reclassified prior to 9th grade are somewhat smaller. On to findings. I just want to get you oriented to how these descriptive plots work using the New York sample. So we look at the proportion of each subgroup that takes a course in a given topic area by the end of a given grade. So here you can see that among our non-Ls, all in blue, never Ls in the darkest blue bar, take Algebra 1 by the end of 8th grade at rates of about 30%, while initially fluent students take Algebra 1 by the end of 8th grade at rates closer to 40%, and former Ls in the light blue color look roughly similar to English-only students. By contrast, current Ls, all in purple, take Algebra 1 by the end of grade 8 at much lower rates, even relative to former Ls. And then all students, non-Ls and current Ls, take Algebra 1 by the end of grade 9. And then we look to see what happens across time as students progress through the math sequence. So geometry 9 rates in grade 9 look roughly similar to the grade 8 algebra rates, which makes some sense. And then we see that newcomer and developing Ls really begin to close that large gap in their access to geometry by the end of grade 11. Similarly, newcomer Ls begin to catch up to English-only students in Algebra 2 by the end of grade 12. So you can really see the sequential quality of the math sequence in how students are completing their coursework over time. And long-term Ls, it's worth noting, remain at a substantial disadvantage for access to Algebra 2 even by the end of grade 12. When we compare New York and Houston using the same process, we see some really notable differences, not so much in the patterns of Algebra 1, which look virtually identical between the 2 cities, but in the patterns of geometry, where we see that students in Houston have much more consistent access to geometry in grade 10 than do students in New York. And that earlier access appears to lead to Ls in Houston taking Algebra 2 somewhat early, many by grade 11, and therefore having enough time to take pre-calculus prior to the end of their expected grade 12, and at much higher rates than they do in New York. So we examined some of the possible explanations for these differences in a set of multi-level logistic regressions with students nested in schools in New York and students nested in schools within districts in Houston. And we predict access to Algebra 2 and beyond by the end of grade 12, controlling for student characteristics such as race, ethnicity, gender, poverty in the form of free reduced lunch, and in New York, the lowest quartile of household income by neighborhood and special education status. We also look at grade 8 course taking and exam taking and grade 8 achievement scores. And I'll just say a few things about how we're thinking about prior academic preparation, which is really about opportunities to learn in middle school and before. We imagine prior academic preparation is going to influence course taking trajectories in high school, both through sorting into high schools, especially in New York, where the school choice process is a really salient feature of the context, and also in the ways that students are sorted into classes once they get there. So our goal here is really to begin to tease out how much of what we observe in the high school course taking is about achievement and how much is access that is structured by earlier access. So these are the unadjusted predicted probabilities for the New York sample. Blue is the English only group, dark purple, the newcomers, and the lightest, lavender, are the long-term Ls. Please note that the axis starts at 0.4 here. And because our sample sizes are so large and the confidence intervals are so tight, the estimate marker often obscures the error bars, but they are there. Here are Houston's unadjusted predicted probabilities for the same subgroups. And particularly noteworthy here are the differences between the two long-term L groups. Long-term Ls in Houston are about 25 percentage points more likely to take Algebra 2 or beyond than similar students in New York. And it's possible this indicates that long-term Ls really can do more than we may expect them to in some contexts. Adding student characteristics into the model changes the picture somewhat, particularly for long-term Ls, who look much more similar to other Ls after controlling for special education status, poverty, and race ethnicity. And this is true in both New York and Houston, although it's more prominent maybe in New York. And it seems to suggest that, at least in New York, the long-term L students really are a different group than students who are newcomers and developing Ls. Similarly, prior course taking and exam taking closes much of the remaining gap in New York, but not in Houston, which suggests that there's more variation in New York in terms of course taking in middle school than is probably the case in Houston. And then among students with similar grade 8 math scores, newcomer Ls in New York actually have a slight advantage relative to English only students. And this seems to be less the case in Houston, but the differences between the two locations are much less pronounced after controlling for prior academic achievement. And long-term Ls in New York, for instance, really do seem to have lower academic achievement in middle school, which in addition to their other student characteristics, helps to explain some of the large gap in their course taking in high school. So by way of a quick recap, I'll just note that at least descriptively, there's some suggestion here that the different levels of access to Algebra 2 have their source in different patterns of grade 10 geometry, but controlling for prior achievement also seems to wipe out many of those differences that we see between the two locations. And this is particularly true for long-term Ls whose unadjusted probabilities for taking Algebra 2 are far lower in New York. But they also seem, based on the models, to be substantially more academically behind prior to entering high school than similar students in Houston. And this is all very preliminary, but we see two main implications of this work that we're thinking about as we move forward. First is the importance of ensuring more equitable and rigorous access to content prior to 9th grade, which is maybe not a brand new implication of some of the work on course taking, but we're also really seeing in the data that the curricular intensification that has taken place for Algebra 1 over the last decade maybe shifting the gatekeeping course more towards geometry, and that geometry is a critical doorway to advanced math topics that we see in both of these contexts. We do have some additional items on our to-do list. So a similar analysis for science progressions and analyses that better account for the heterogeneity among former Ls. Both of these we've already begun. We'd also like to employ some more nuanced academic controls that use the course-specific prerequisites. And finally, we'd like to thank the Research Alliance at New York City Schools and the Education Research Center at the University of Houston for their access to the data and for their technical support. And on the New York side, the Division of Multilingual Learners at the New York City Department of Education provided some helpful comments on early drafts. And of course, the research here was generously supported by the Institute of Education Sciences, but does not reflect their views. Thank you.
All right. Thank you, everyone, for joining us. It looks like the entry has slowed down a little bit. So this is the session on dual language learners. And we have the presenters here, as well as the program officer, Helen Kim, And thank you again for joining us. There's a chat in the chat. Helen posted a comment. So if you have a minute, rate how useful the information in this session was. Feel free to rate it. So any questions, comments, suggestions? Go ahead, feel free to either put it in the chat, or I guess you could use your raise your hand function, or you can just unmute yourself and talk. We are here to answer questions and engage in conversations.
I have a question for Dr. Black and her team. So I'm curious if the state policies for the identification of ELs and newcomers or exiting procedures has any consequences for the academic outcomes that you saw.
Yeah, I have no doubt that they do. I am unfortunately not an expert in how the reclassification process works in Texas. I do know that they use a different set of tests, and there's some additional academic requirements that are attached to the reclassification process in Texas that are not present in New York. So that might be part of it. I do know that the policy context around math course taking is quite different, and particularly at the state level, there are, at least in New York, there is an option to take 4 credits of Algebra 1, which all apply to graduation requirements. And so I think what we're seeing in the New York data, in particular for Ls and perhaps for other students who are labeled by schools as meeting it, are the consequences of that allowance for 4 credits of Algebra 1. That's a relatively new discovery on the policy front for us, just that there's this relationship between potentially the credit options in New York and what's actually happening on the ground. So we're still thinking about exactly how that's working, but that's what we're looking right now at as the main policy issue here.
Yes, looks like Tricia. Go ahead.
Thank you guys for organizing this session. It was all really interesting. I am just so interested in hearing more from Doris Baker about this automated scoring, because all of us as researchers are so tired of scoring children's definitions. And I've given up in my research because it was so time consuming and costly. And so I'd like to hear a little bit about just sort of the readiness for sort of prime time of that technology. And also if you could link it to some of what Maria talked about with cognates, and if you looked at cognates at all in your work.
Yeah, thanks, Tricia. Yeah, I think that the scoring of student vocabulary, particularly sentences, and is really challenging. We are just exploring it at this point. We did, some studies that kind of are showing us some promise, like we saw the language models that, at least were 70% reliable compared to human scoring, but it's still, we're still kind of like investigating it more. So now we discovered that the language model, the BERT, has done a little bit better than previous models. So we're going to be exploring that more with a larger sample that we're planning on collecting actually this spring, hopefully, given all the issues. But yeah, so I will know much more about the automatic scoring once we start testing the other models. But it's a discovery process, and it's trying things out and seeing how it works and figuring out what works and what doesn't work. So also within the language model, so we can see if we can add what one of ideas is just adding more wording. I mean, we kind of use the AWS, the Amazon World Service, to see what the corpus of words are, but then we might include additional words that students might use in the dictionary would not capture, like, for example, proper names, no? So since it's science, for example, if they say something about Isaac Newton or any other scientist, then the model wouldn't capture it, the system wouldn't capture it. So we're trying to figure out how we can include and who we should include based on the standards and what we expect students are learning in the early grade, the second, third grade, to add to the pool of words that are already available for us to test it. Yeah. But yeah, so yeah, I'll keep you posted, but and on the process and the progress. Hopefully by the end of this semester, we'll have a better understanding of how or which language model would work the best. Yeah.
Well, we'll all keep our fingers crossed you figure that out. and would you also talk a little bit about cognates and your technical vocabulary that you selected? Were there any cognates, and did you look at that?
Yes, they are. Yeah, in fact, right now, because we're finalizing the measure to get it tested, we decided that we're going to include the Spanish name of the word, use of the word too, so that students who are, because the focus is really on English learners, so we want to make sure that that language is not an impediment for them to understand the word. And so you can imagine with science words, most of the words are actually cognates. And so it will be interesting to follow up with Maria's research too, actually, and see how that will work and if that is helping kids understand the words better. Yeah.
Doris, thank you so much. Teresa, thank you for your question. Doris, there's a question in the chat. Can you talk about also custom cloud transcriptions?
Yeah, I'm not sure exactly what you mean by that, Aiden. Yeah, what we're doing is mostly we're going to put everything in the Amazon World Services, and so there's going to be that server that will have all the information, all our data, and from there we will be getting it out to analyze it and see how it's working. Yeah, but for now we're using mostly readily available services, just like that one. Yeah, I hope this helps. Yeah.
Any additional questions, thoughts?
David Francis, so nice to see you, and Jerry Misiak, it's so good to see you too. My wonderful co-authors on this study. I fielded a question earlier about potential differences between Texas and New York in the reclassification process and how that might be playing out for math course taking, and I answered it poorly, so maybe one of you has a better
I'm sure that's
response.
not true. I'm sure that's absolutely untrue, but what was the question? Sorry, we were a little late getting here. So.
Not at all. The question is, yeah, I'll let Dr. Hogan.
Oh, thank you. Hi, Jeremy and David. Kristen did wonderfully. That was not a poor answer, but I'm just curious if there was any evidence that the way Texas and New York perhaps differentially exit students or classify students as EL could have impacted their course taking.
Yeah, it's hard for me to know the answer to that, Erin. In part, we've got to deal with differences in regulations and rules that the states have, but we've also got to deal with differences in the vagaries of the data sets that we're dealing with and the nature of the information that we have for deciding, you know, how exactly to characterize this particular student at this particular moment in time. It seems unlikely to me that that's a major source of difference between the states, but it certainly could contribute. And Texas's rules have changed over the years, so it's possible we could look at other years to see how things might play out differently. But I suspect that to the extent that is a factor, it's interacting with regulations tied to what courses are available to students more than anything else, right? So the major difference is not the rules for reclassification, but how those rules for reclassification are bumping up against any policies and practices within the schools would probably be the driving force. But I don't really have data that I could point to say, I think this is this is what it is, as opposed to something else.
These awkward Zoom silences are so fun, aren't they? So ready for them to be over. I have a question, but it's kind of more of like a big picture question, so whoever can answer it. I've been thinking a lot about how every paper or grant we write often starts with the NAEP scores and this motivation for this sort of differences between achievement in kids who are classified as ELs and kids who aren't. But also thinking about the fact that a lot of these kids are assessed in their non-dominant language and instructed in their non-dominant language. And I've just been thinking a lot about like, what would that NAEP graph look like in a perfect world? Like, where are we trying to go? Do we think that it's really possible, or even should be the objective, that kids who are being assessed in their non-dominant language would score on par with monolingual English-speaking kids? So is closing the gap even what we should be trying to do? I know that's kind of a really big picture question, but it's been on my mind lately, and there's a lot of people in this room that I would love to hear their thoughts on that.
Well, I'll be happy to go first since I'm unmuted and everybody else has their microphones muted. I think that I've talked about this, I've written about this. I'm certainly not alone in talking about and writing about this, but I think that comparing the performance of English learners while they're still English learners to non-English learners who are proficient, and trying to make heads or tails out of those comparisons is kind of a fool's errand. And that Bill Saunders has written about this and then referred to it as the gap that can't go away. And what we see is that as kids become proficient, and I'll actually talk about this a bit in my plenary, but that as kids become proficient in English, their performance is really quite comparable to the never English learner students. And we do our schools and our students a huge disservice to always be focusing on the comparison between students who are not yet proficient in English and students who are proficient in English. That's not the most interesting or informative or important comparison. And even from the standpoint of trying to explain to a school or understand whether a school is doing a good job or a poor job, just looking at the size of that difference is not really informative, because as the number of students who are at the first sort of level of English proficiency versus the second, third, fourth transitioning level of English proficiency, unless you know the percentages in those categories and that the percentages are staying constant, you can't even make sense of the difference because of Simpson's paradox, so to speak. So I think that we do our students and our schools a big disservice by focusing specifically on that comparison without conditioning on the level of language proficiency of the students that are actually being compared. so that we can actually get a meaningful number out of it, and understanding that the state of a student's language proficiency is just where they're at currently, and that they're on a developmental path to develop proficiency, and we need to be able to follow those kids. The thing that I don't like about the way you're framing the question, or the thing that I would object to about the way you're framing the question, Ashley, is that it's not really, it's not really about whether that's their best language in which to be tested for English, for achievement, because they may be more proficient conversationally in another language, but they may not have had any instruction in that language in mathematics or science or social studies or even literacy. So the language in which the students should be tested for achievement should be the language in which they're being instructed for that achievement. But what we expect for them in terms of performance needs to be graduated based on where they're at in their development of English proficiency. And so the expectations need to be adjusted, to an extent for the current moment in time, but not the long-term expectations for students. The long-term expectation for students have to be the same. It should be the same. And so that's my take on it. Other people may have a different opinion, but that's sort of what I would say.
Thank you so much.
I can't have the first and last word on that question. It's a really important question.
Nobody wants to follow that very, very good answer.
But no, I want to, to say that, yeah, I totally agree with David. And I think that the important thing is, what is the language of instruction? No, are they in bilingual program, or are they in an English only program? And just with that, you can decide what is it that we need to understand the academic level of students who are English learners. And then also, of course, what resources the school has to provide them with the supports if they need the support. And that is where I always have a little bit of a difficult time, because in the districts, there are not the resources. We all want bilingual programs, but then we don't have the resources to support the kids. And then, of course, there's a lot of failure, or a lot of differences, and language is not static. And so there's all these questions that I think sometimes we don't answer, or we answer very lightly. And the consequences is played by, unfortunately, the kids who are in the bilingual programs. Now, that's why, the majority of the parents of English learners actually don't want their kids to be in a bilingual program, because they think that they should be learning English and not Spanish, for example, not particularly. And the reason is because they don't see the progress or the understanding and the resources that the schools have to support their kids when they are struggling. So anyway, 2 cents there, but yeah.
I see Aiden has a question.
Yeah, I don't know if I'm unmuted. Yeah. Will your data, David and Kristen, would your study have some impact on maybe moving English learners to like math and science classes earlier, while their English proficiency may not be at very high levels? Because at the same time, they may not be able to take English literature classes in high school very early, but math and science may be a different story. And some of your data showing, like in Houston, individuals seem to be doing pretty well when it comes to geometry and algebra too. And taking those classes is a hopeful sign. Or am I over-interpreting this?
I don't think you're over-interpreting. That is my fond hope, that those would be the consequences of these findings. I didn't show it in this presentation, but when we look at the rates of failure for English learners, and particularly current English learners in this scheme versus English only students, they're exactly the same. There's almost no difference between them in terms of their rates of failing Algebra 1. But what we see is that English learners are lingering in Algebra 1 in the New York context in ways that we don't see in Texas. And so, yeah, I would definitely hope that we would be able to move L's more quickly into geometry and get them into upper level math faster. And I'll add also that I know that this is a policy issue that the New York City DOE has on their minds, that they have concerns about the way the state has permitted this 4-credit sequence of Algebra 1 and would really like to move L's more quickly through the math sequence. So I'm even hopeful we might be able to make a change in how this works.
Yeah, and I think being able to do that and then figuring out specifically what we do to make sure that students have the same opportunity for success and that failure rates are not different for students based on their level of English proficiency. I think that's the key. So we do hope it has an impact on what courses students are able to take and that they're able to get into grade level math, science, English language arts courses at the most appropriate time and where their success is not different for English learners and non-English learners.
There's a question by Nicole. I think this is about dual immersion program. So my daughter's elementary school is transitioning their DLI program to have greater Spanish instruction in early years and gradually tapering off. The program has both Spanish-speaking ELLs and English-only students. Any thoughts on that? So Nicole, I'm curious about your question itself. If you don't mind specifying some kind of elaborating a little bit on your question.
So I guess it's with regard to, if they have more instruction in their home language in Spanish in the earlier years, would that be thought to just encourage their basic learning of the fundamentals of math and vocabulary, or is the preference for them to more quickly move into English language so that they just can master the English language sooner, and how that impacts their later learning of other vocabulary and their math skills? Like what's known, I guess, on when they should be doing more intensive English work with regard to the broad impact of language on learning?
So I guess it depends on the goal of these bilingual programs, right? So those that start, typically the dual language programs have a much greater proportion of language, I guess, instructional time in, I guess, whatever the target language is, right? A lot of times it could be Spanish or Chinese, whatever the language program is. So depending, some programs, the goal is transitioning off to English, but a lot of times I think these days it's actually maintaining both languages, developing English proficiency. And for those non-Spanish speaking students, it's developing Spanish language proficiency. I think that's intentional so that the exposure, right? So that's why there's a mixture of Spanish speaking students and English speaking students, or any other language, I guess, pairs. So my understanding, I could be very wrong. Before it was much more of a transitional kind of a model, but I think people are more aware now. It's kind of a moving toward a more of a maintaining and developing both language skills. Did that answer the question? And please, any other experts here in the panel?
That's the concern that I would have, or the question that I would be wondering about in this case, is the native English speakers now getting more of their instruction in Spanish than what the previous mix was, and what the implications for them will be, or how they'll support their academic development for the English speaking students in those dual language programs. Usually for the dual language programs, the goal is that all students come out bilingual. And so the shift there, I would be wanting to monitor the performance of the English speaking students and whether or not they're getting everything that they need. I would have to say that we don't have a lot of research on the differences in the language mixes, like if it's 80-20, 50-50, 20-80, who that benefits and who it doesn't benefit, and how much difference there is, what's the length of time over which that difference gets mitigated, whether or not it gets fully mitigated. And so we just don't have a lot of studies that compare different language mixes for dual language programs and whether or not certain mixes are more effective than other mixes in terms of the long-term outcomes for students. So, anything that I'm saying, this is just all speculative on my part in terms of how these things might play out differently, because I don't know that there's really good studies comparing empirically those different approaches within dual language, right? We can talk about differences between dual language, early and late transition programs, maintenance programs. We know how they're different. And the differences tend to be really with respect to the L1, right? The outcomes with respect to Spanish, less so outcomes with respect to English. But I don't know how it would work in terms of adjusting those mixes within a dual language program. I don't know if Aiden or Maria might have some thoughts on that.
I mean, I agree with your assessment of the sort of state of our knowledge about this, but I guess it also all depends when the transitioning is happening. I guess we don't know in this case, but yeah, I'd be very suspect about moving into basically a TBE model too early for Spanish speakers in terms of them being able to reap any benefits from their first language, and also too early for native English speakers, essentially interfering with them being able to develop sufficient, say, Spanish skills, if that's the alternate language, to be able to have any sort of academic level proficiency, because that's the other thing, right? In all of this, we're talking about academic level proficiency in both languages, and not just getting the native English speakers to be able to have sort of everyday conversations. The idea would be to get them academically proficient in Spanish as well. So I don't know. I guess it all depends on when that transition would happen. And I agree, we make many of these decisions without the data that we need to make it, unfortunately.
I have another question on a different topic. For the higher order thinking and writing skills study, that was pretty hopeful for me also, because have you been looking at what parents are actually doing at home? What I'm trying to get at is, if higher order skills in English and Spanish are similarly feeding into the writing quality, then is it possible that parents can be doing some of this perspective taking, inferencing kinds of activities at home in their strong language? If they speak Spanish, do it in Spanish. If they speak English, do it in English, and still expect to get some benefits regardless of the language they speak at home.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, thank you so much, Aiden, for this great question. Unfortunately, our response rate from parents were extremely low. We tried it, and I think perhaps the low response rate from parents might be, I guess, partially due to COVID as well, because it overlapped, the data collection time overlapped. But we did try, we did have survey, but the response rate was very low. We could not really do anything meaningful, like, for example, statistically. But that's a really good question, and we wanted to address it, but I don't think we would be able to in this study, unfortunately.
Thank you.
Thank you for the question. So we have about 4 minutes left for the Q&A sessions. Any other questions or thoughts? Sure, if any questions come up after you take give some thoughts, feel free to email us. I think email addresses are available on the PowerPoint as well as on the attendee list. So feel free to share those with us. And there's a comment. Feel free to rate the session as well. I think that'll be very informative for IES and us.
Thank you all so much for coming.
Thank you. Thanks to Young for putting it together.
Thank you. This was very interesting a really good collection of studies, ranging different topics. Very, very interesting. Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you.
Well, we'll look forward to our future sessions together.
Okay. Bye-bye, everybody.
Bye. See you around. Yeah.
Bye-bye.